But it's actually a very misleading distinction. So as soon as we actually start looking at real development, what we see is that that distinction doesn't really make sense. At every level, from the very beginning of development to the very end, and from social development to cognitive development to even straightforward biological development, what we see is a kind of constant interplay between nature and nurture. And that sounds kind of kumbaya, yeah, it's a little of this and a little of that, but it isn't just that nature and nurture interact, it's that they can interact in very complicated and different kinds of ways. So what I'm going to do today is to give you a couple of examples of just how complicated the interactions between our genetic inheritance and our experience, nature and nurture, actually can turn out to be. And I want you to keep that in mind for the rest of the course as we're talking about development. And you should also keep it in mind as you read the New York Times or look on the web and see headlines that say things like that they've discovered a gene for X or they've discovered that Y is actually in the brain. So let me start out with an example that's extremely simple, not anything very fancy at all. And that is the case of PKU or phenylketonuria. Phenylketonuria. I always get that wrong. Okay, phenylketonuria. So what's phenylketonuria? Whenever a new baby's born, one of the very first things they do, just as soon as the baby's born, is to take a little tiny sample of blood and test it to see whether the baby might have phenylketonuria or PKU. And phenylketonuria is actually a genetic condition, so you can detect it as soon as the babies are born. But it's actually a genetic condition which can lead to really terrible, severe mental retardation. So in the past, what happened was if you had this particular gene, it's a gene that means that you have a hard time digesting a particular amino acid. What happened is that you died at a young age and you suffered terrible mental retardation. So you'd think, okay, that's a pretty clear example of something that's genetic. You have the gene, you end up mentally retarded. You don't have the gene, you don't end up mentally retarded. But it turns out that it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. Because as I mentioned, the reason why phenylketonuria causes mental retardation is because it makes the body not able to metabolize certain kinds of substances that are in your food. And those substances become sort of poisonous and cause damage to the brain. So if you give children a diet that doesn't include any of those substances, if you're just very, very careful about what the babies eat, then babies don't end up having mental retardation. They do have phenylketonuria, but they don't actually suffer the effects of mental retardation. And that's the reason why we screen babies as soon as they're born to make sure to find out whether they're suffering from this genetic defect or not, because that means that then you can start the babies on a diet regime that will keep them from developing mental retardation. So this seems like a pretty straightforward case, but here's what's important about it. What's important about it is if you were to ask whether or how much the mental retardation of phenylketonuria is caused by genetic genes or the environment, the answer wouldn't be, well, it's half genes and half the environment. The answer would be that it's 100% genes and it's 100% the environment. So if you have this genetic disorder, you won't ever get this particular kind of mental retardation unless you have this particular genetic disorder. So the genetic disorder is 100% responsible for the syndrome. But it is also true that if you're not in an environment in which these substances are in your diet, then you also won't get phenylketonuria. So it's completely determined by what your genes are like, and it's also completely determined by what your diet is like, what your environment is like. And there's an interesting point to make about this, which is that I think this is a particularly interesting case because if we were just, say, looking at non-human animals, then you would say this is a completely genetically determined syndrome. Because the thing that's distinctive about human beings is that we have the capacity to actually intervene and change the environment that we grow up in. So if we couldn't change our environment, then it would be true that your genes were 100% responsible for phenylketonuria. But the fact that we as human beings can find out about something like PKU, and we can actually intervene to change our environment, so now it's a different environment in which PKU won't lead to mental retardation, actually that's the kind of crucial thing that means that both nature and nurture are 100% responsible for this syndrome. And that's important because, after all, what's characteristic of us as human beings is exactly the fact that we can get to change our own environment. So whenever someone says, yes, something's the result of something that's innate versus something that's there in the environment, what you should say to yourself is, well, that's this environment. What would happen if you had the same set of genes in a different environment? Suppose the environment was actually different. Let me give another example of this that is particularly relevant probably for people in this room. So sometimes people debate whether the fact that there aren't more women at the higher echelons of science is the result of something about women's genes or women's biology, or it's the result of something about the environment in which they grow up. And you may remember a couple of years ago, Lawrence Summers, who was the president of Harvard, said that it was the result of things about women's biology. So they didn't really have to do anything at Harvard to encourage more women to go into science. Now, if you think about that for a minute, that's a really good example of the fact that environments can change. So in the environment of the hunter-gatherers, right, there was no relationship between being a woman and being a scientist because there weren't any scientists. So nobody was a scientist. If you'd looked, you wouldn't have found any difference between women being scientists and men being scientists. If you'd looked 100 or 150 years ago in Europe, there would have been 100% relationship between biologically being a female and succeeding in science or not, because women weren't allowed to take science classes or be scientists, including my own mother, for example. So in that circumstance, there would be 100% predictability that if you were biologically a woman, then you would not be able to be successful as a scientist. In an environment 20 years from now, or in the environment in some Scandinavian countries where they've made a concerted effort to put girls in science classes, we see much greater participation of women in science. So in that environment, or in an environment in which women didn't have to choose between having babies and going into a profession, then you might see that difference between men and women in science completely disappear. So when we say that something's genetic or the result of genes or the result of the environment, it depends on what environment we're talking about. And since we're humans and we can change our environment, there's always the possibility that the genes are going to be expressed in a really different way in a different environment. Okay, let me give you a second example, still biological, but and still now not talking about women in science or anything complicated or anything like what we might think about with humans. Just to show that the situation, the relationship between nature and nurture in the environment and the genes is even more complicated than we might think. So here's the example, and this is what I'll call the case of the faithful voles. One of the things so here's some bad news from biology. The bad news from biology is that there's no species that's sexually monogamous. So when you actually do DNA analysis, well, I guess it's bad news or good news depending on your point of view, but I will say that this is bad news. So even if you look at swans, at pigeons, at all the beautiful symbols of fidelity in metaphors and poems, it turns out that they fool around. So even swans fool around. But the good news is that many species, probably including us, engage in what biologists call social monogamy. That means that the pairs that mate with one another also spend time together, sing songs together, make nests together, raise the young together. Now that may seem obvious, but it's actually interesting that most species don't do that. So it's not that this is just naturally comes with mating. Most species, and certainly most species of mammals and primates, not only fool around sexually, but wouldn't even kind of get the concept because they don't form males and females don't form bonds of any sort. They don't spend time together. They don't raise babies together and so forth. So that's true for most species of mammals. But it's not true for some. And an interesting question is, why is it that some animals show this kind of pair bonding and faithful interaction, and other animals don't? And obviously that's a really interesting question, and sometimes an urgent question if you're talking about human beings. But let's not talk about human beings. Let's just talk about voles. Voles are little mammals that look like this. And it turns out that voles are a kind of wonderful test case to answer this question, because there are two different species of voles that are very closely related to one another, just slightly genetically different. The prairie voles and the montane voles. The prairie voles, as the name suggests, actually live on the prairies, and the montane voles live in the mountains. And these two types of animals are very similar, but they have very different mating patterns. So the prairie voles are like swans. They're cuddly, faithful, happy little creatures that spend all their time together and care for each other and lick and kiss and cuddle. And the montane voles are basically horn dogs. So, the montane vole males go around and mate, or vice versa. The montane vole males and females mate with whoever's around. Okay, why is there this difference in the way that they behave? Well, it turns out that that difference is related to a couple of chemicals, a couple of hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. And we're going to hear some more about oxytocin and vasopressin later on in the class, because they seem to play an important role even in humans in our attachments to one another, our ability to love one another. And it turns out that essentially what happens is that if you suppress these chemicals, so you keep the animals from, change the animals' genes so that those chemicals can't be taken up. And the prairie voles actually act like montane voles. So in other words, if you deprive the prairie voles of oxytocin, they don't receive any oxytocin, then they start acting like the montane voles. They don't engage in this kind of pair bonding. So you might think, okay, well, it's simple. Oxytocin causes love. So if you just take enough oxytocin, then you kind of slip it into your boyfriend's drink, and you won't have anything to worry about. But unfortunately, it turns out that it's actually more complicated than that. Because on the other hand, if you give the chemicals to the montane voles, so you give the montane voles a bunch of oxytocin, and there's no difference. They don't become any more faithful. So there's something that's going on about oxytocin and vasopressin. Take away the oxytocin from the prairie voles, and they stop being faithful. But it isn't just as simple as that, because if you give the oxytocin to the montane voles, then they don't show any changes in their behavior. Well, it turns out that what happens is that the prairie voles have genetically determined receptors for oxytocin. So in other words, the prairie voles' brains are designed so that they're sensitive to the effects of oxytocin. So if oxytocin is there, then the prairie voles are more faithful, and if oxytocin isn't there, then the prairie voles act like the montane voles. And the montane voles, on the other hand, don't have these kind of receptors for oxytocin. And again, the things that you can do with voles that you can't do with humans, if you just change the montane voles' genes so that now they're like the prairie voles' genes, then the montane voles, if they get oxytocin, actually start behaving more faithfully. Okay. So what happens is there's a difference in the genes to begin with. There really is a difference in the genes. But what the difference in the genes does is it makes the animals differentially sensitive to the environment. So it's not just the prairie genes make the voles faithful and the montane genes make them promiscuous. It's that the prairie genes make them faithful if they get oxytocin. Okay. And it turns out that it's even more complicated than that. Because it turns out that it isn't just that genes cause you to produce oxytocin or not, but behavior actually makes you produce oxytocin. So in voles, when voles groom one another, when they sort of poke one another and engage in certain kinds of social interactions, they're more likely to produce oxytocin. And that turns out to actually be true in humans for kissing and hugging as well. So kissing and hugging is a good strategy if you want a happy, faithful relationship. More kissing and hugging. So kissing and hugging produces oxytocin. But now you can see that there's kind of a loop going on here, because you start out with these prairie voles that genetically are more sensitive to oxytocin. And the prairie voles also produce more of these behaviors that cause more oxytocin to be produced. So in the course of being pair bonded, what it means to be pair bonded is that the animals are spending a lot of time together and mutually grooming and interacting and behaving, and that's actually leading to more oxytocin production, and the oxytocin production is making them spend more time together and groom each other more. So there's a kind of benign cycle going on where the animals start out being more inclined to engage in this kind of pair bonding. But the very act of engaging in these kind of pair bonding behaviors makes the animals produce more oxytocin, and then that makes them produce more pair bonding. So there's really a kind of three-stage process that's going on here. It starts out with the voles being it starts out with the voles having different kinds of genes, but then those genes lead to different productions of these chemicals and different uptake of the chemicals, and then the uptake of the chemical leads to different kinds of behaviors, and then the behaviors lead to changes in the chemicals. So the point here is that it's, as you might expect if you're talking about things like whether people are being faithful or not, it's complicated, right? So even for voles, if you were going to put their relationship status up on Facebook, even for the prairie voles, the real relationship status you should have up is it's complicated. Let's have one of the, I mentioned last time that what we're going to do is have these explanation breaks in the class. So let's have an explanation break now. Why don't we start out for the first one? I'm trying to figure out if we should, maybe the simplest thing to do is to go from the outside. So start out with the people on the outside of the rows, turning to the person next to them and explaining to them why it is that some vole species are more faithful than others. I talked about the idea behind this before, but trust me, studies show that this will actually make you remember this better and understand it better than if you don't. So just turn to the person next to you, take 5 minutes, and it'll be a good chance to meet the person next to you. Okay. This is sort of an experiment. That was 5 minutes. Do you think people could do it in 3 or 4? Would that be better, or 5? Any votes for 5? 5 minutes? 3 minutes? 3. Okay. So let's make it. We'll make it 3. And that looks great. People were waving their hands and they were nodding, and there was obviously real intense explanation going on there. And at some point in the course, I will tell you about my well-known but almost always miscited paper explanation as orgasm. And you'll really appreciate that after several months of giving all these explanations in class. Okay, so let's think, here's yet another example of how complicated these interactions are between nature and nurture. So in the example of the voles that I just gave you before, we were talking about adult animals who are either getting certain kinds of environmental cues, like particular kinds of chemicals, or have a particular kind of genetics. It turns out that you see these effects even more strikingly in young animals. So you see interactions between nature and nurture taking place particularly intensely in very young animals. And this whole area of research, which is called epigenetics, has become a really major, important development in biology and genetics over the past 10 or 15 years. And let me just give you one of the really beautiful classic examples of this. What this is all about is the fact that even when you have a particular set of genes, what really matters for the way that you behave, or for that matter, the way you are, is how those genes are expressed. And you should all know that from sort of basic biology. So you start out with a bunch of genes, but what really makes the difference to the proteins that you produce and ultimately the kind of creature and organism you are is how those genes are expressed. And the big discovery has been that the environment that you're in can make a big difference in the way that those genes are expressed. So in one environment, one set of genes can end up producing one set of behaviors. In another environment, the same set of genes can be expressed differently and produce a different set of behaviors. So let me give you this example that comes from Michael Meany, and Darlene Francis, who's here at Berkeley, was also involved in this work. And what they did was they started out with 2 different strains of mice. And one of the good things about doing experiments with mice is that you can make sure that all the mice have exactly the same genes. So these are 2 strains of mice. All the mice you know, because you've bred these mice, are absolutely identical genetically. And it turns out that when you do that, some of the mice are actually smarter than others of the mice. So some strains of mice, if you put them in a water maze, for example, will very rapidly figure out how to navigate the maze. And other strains of mice just flounder around and can't do anything in a maze. And these 2 strains of mice are like that. So there is what I will technically call the dumb mice and the smart mice. So there's the dumb strain of mice and the smart strain of mice. And that might seem to be a really good case for a strong genetic argument about a relationship between, say, genes and intelligence, or genes or IQ. What could be stronger? You have one bunch of mice with one set of genes and they're smart. You have another set of mice with another set of genes that they're dumb. Obviously, the genes are causing intelligence. But it turns out that mice also, like human beings, are engaged in mothering behaviors. This is a really cute slide of a mama mouse and these little tiny bare naked pink baby mice. Now, what the mama mice basically do is, which is perhaps not so recommended for humans, is they poke the babies. So they kind of bat the babies with their noses. So they have these kind of nose pokes that they do for the babies. But as far as the mice are concerned, you know, a nose poke is as good as a kiss and a hug and a cuddle. It's a way of being in physical contact with the babies. So the moms stimulate the babies by producing these kind of nose pokes. So in the experiments that Meany and his colleagues did, and again, these are experiments you could do with mice rather than with that you couldn't do with humans. What they did was actually implant the embryos of one strain of mice, implant the embryos of the dumb strain into the wombs of the smart strain. So these are babies that are genetically from the dumb strain, but now literally from before they're born, they're being raised in a smart mouse environment. And what they discovered was that when they implanted the dumb strain mouse in the smart mother, the mothers, because this is what smart mothers do, actually licked and groomed the babies more, and the babies grew up to be as smart as the smart mice did. So, in other words, it turned out that the difference between the dumb mice and the smart mice wasn't really a difference about their genetic inheritance, or it was, but the form the genetic inheritance was taking was that the dumb mice weren't getting as nurtured as the smart mice were. And when you took the dumb mice and you put them in a nurturing environment, as it were, then they turned out to do just as well at mazes when they grew up. Yeah?
So I'm a little confused because you're saying that both these mice are genetically identical, and that
the two strains are genetically different, but all the mice within each strain are genetically identical.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Thanks for getting me to clarify that. Yeah. So the two strains are genetically different, but within each group, all of the mice are genetically identical. Okay. Yeah.
Is there the reverse? Did they put the mice
With the dumb mothers, I don't know whether they did that experiment or not, and I'm not quite sure what the outcomes would have been. But I can check and find out. Now, an interesting other thing about this was that if you did this later on in the baby's development, so if you just took the dumb mice and after they developed for a little while, and mice develop a lot faster than humans do, and then you gave them to the smart mums to raise, and the mums licked and groomed them, that didn't make a difference. So in other words, it wasn't just that the babies were getting more licking and grooming. It was that they were getting more licking and grooming from very, very, very early on in their development. Yeah? Good. Great. I have a stooge in the audience. That's exactly the next point. So it turned out that, so the babies grow up smart. Next slide. In fact, it turns out that then when you look at those babies who were fostered by the smart mice, when they themselves have babies, they produce more licking and grooming and poking behavior. So they're being more nurturant to their babies than the dumb mice mothers will. And there's actually a cross-generational effect. So then when you look at their babies are also smarter, are also like the original smart babies. Yeah? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So the two strains are not just differing in their intellect, but they're also differing in how much nurturing they do of the babies. And it turns out that nurturing is really the thing that's making the difference to the babies growing up. But because you don't get these effects if you simply swap out the nurturing later on, it's something about what's happening in the baby's brains at this very, very early stage that seems to be the thing that's making the difference later. So it isn't just quite whether they get nurtured or not, it's whether they get nurtured in this very early developmental period. And the story seems to be that essentially the smart mice and the dumb mice, the dumb mice have the same genetic potential, as it were, as the smart mice. They can get their brains wired up in the same way that the smart mice have their brains wired up. It's just that they don't typically get their brains wired up that way in the typical environment that they have where they're not getting licked and groomed a lot as babies. And of course, from a mouse perspective, if those mice don't particularly need to be smart, then there's no reason why they should need that kind of, produce that kind of grooming and nurturing behavior from an evolutionary perspective. Yeah?
In the book, the example of the Romanian children.
Yeah, we're going to get there.
Once they're over 24 to 48 months, it's like, what, if it's going to attribute so much to the cycle, then, what can be done for someone to
right.
that?
Okay, let's get to, again, another stooge in the audience. This is great. You guys will all get paid after the lecture. Next slide. Okay. So far we've been talking about voles and mice and little critters. How about human beings? Well, we can see some of the same kinds of interactions between nature and nurture in human beings. Now, obviously, we can't do these experiments with human beings, but there's actually a terrible, cruel experiment of nature that was performed on human beings. And this is the case of the Romanian orphans. So these were children that during the bad old days of the Ceausescu regime in Romania back in the 80s, there were, for reasons that are sort of obscure, many, many children were placed in these terrible orphanages where they were just kind of attended to enough to stay alive, but nobody ever talked with them or played with them or interacted with them. They were basically lying in cribs by themselves all day long. And sure enough, when you looked at those babies, they looked as if they were terribly, terribly damaged. So when you actually examined the babies at the time that they were... fortunately, what happened was that there was a great push to take these babies and young children and have them adopted by loving British parents. So at the time when they were adopted, these babies, as you might expect, looked really severely retarded. They were physically, their brains weren't as large as other babies. They were physically shrunken. They looked as if they weren't thriving. They were much smaller than other babies were. They didn't talk. They wouldn't interact in a normal social way with the other people who were around them. But so it might look as if you would have real reservations about adopting one of these babies. These babies looked like they were terribly damaged early on. But it turned out that when these babies were adopted, actually most of the babies came out perfectly well, went to college, looked similar to the natural children of the families that adopted them. So even though there was all this damage early on, in a nurturing context, there was potential for recovery. However, at the same time, these children were more at risk for problems later on. So these children, even though most of them actually came out okay, if you compared this group of children with, say, typically developing children like their siblings in the adopted families, they were more at risk for having all sorts of problems, social and emotional and intellectual problems later on. Yeah?
Does that partly have to do with, or the developing normally, does that have more to do with how humans have a longer childhood than mice? Like, did the older ones not?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So let me just get to the next point, which is relevant to this. It also turned out that you could predict how much at risk the children were by how long they had spent in the orphanages. So the older the children were at the time that they were adopted, the more likely they were to have problems later on. So it looked as if the experience had really affected them, and it affected them in ways that for some children ended up having these long-term effects. And it was connected to the experience. So it wasn't just, for instance, that these children happened to be more at risk genetically than other children were. But unlike the mice, there was much more potential for recovery and change in the humans. And interestingly, although Michael Rudder, who did these experiments, has now been studying these children. Their children are now in their 20s. They haven't yet figured out exactly what it is about some of the children that seem to make them resilient, that seem to let them recover, and about other children that kept them at risk. So there's some complicated interaction going on between the genetics of these children and their relationship to the environment that seem to have caused the outcomes. Yeah?
Is there a difference between children that were placed in the orphanage as infants or very young compared to children that were placed there as toddlers?
Yeah.
I read about the story, it must have been before this, where they actually did an experiment with young infants, and the nurse would like literally just give them the bottle, not look at them, no eye contact, no touching, and most of those infants died before they were 2.
Yeah. Well, this is a whole other line of research that we'll talk about later on. So a lot of the work that we originally came not from anyone deliberately doing the experiment, but when they did observations of children in different orphanages, they discovered that in the orphanages where children didn't have continuity of care, where they were physically taken care of but didn't have the emotional care, those children did incredibly badly. And as I mentioned, when they looked at these children, the Romanian children, at the time they were adopted, many of them had died. These were just the children who were the survivors. The finding is that the amount of time that the babies were in the orphanages was the thing that was predicted, but it was sort of conflated, right? Because all the babies were taken out of the orphanages at the same time. So it was hard to tell whether what you were talking about was how young they were when they were in the orphanages, or how much time they'd spent in the orphanages overall. Okay. Okay, so there's another example of a complicated interaction between nature and nurture. And let me just mention one more. So there's these complicated interactions between nature and nurture that depend on our environments. But of course, one of the other things that makes human beings distinctive is that we actually have beliefs about the world. So we actually think things about the world. We have beliefs about the way the world works. And our beliefs about the way that the world works and how we work can have really strong influences on our behavior. And let me give you an example. So far what I showed with the epigenetics and with the Romanian orphans is that our intelligence, which we might think is just something that's the result of our genetics, actually turns out to be very malleable and to be very influenced by our environment, even if we're rats. For people, there's another way in which our intelligence can be influenced by our environment, and that has to do with our beliefs. So this is work that Carol Dweck did, and what she did was ask people what they thought about IQ, what they thought about intelligence. Did they think that intelligence was something that was fixed and part of your genes, or did they think that it was something that was fluid and flexible and could change, for instance, as a result of hard work and studying? So they asked kids questions like, do you think that you could get to be smarter just by working really hard? And what she discovered was that there were differences. Some people, some kids, and some cultures thought that IQ was something that was genetic, that you couldn't change very much, and some people thought that it was something that was fluid and that you could change. And what she discovered was that the people who thought that you could change it actually did better on school tasks than the people who thought that you couldn't change it. So thinking that you could get, and you can sort of see the rationale for this, if you think you could get smarter as a result of studying more, then you'll study more. And studying more actually does seem to help you to at least do better in school. And in fact, they discovered that they could just take a random sample of school children and give half of them a presentation that said things like, your brain changes a lot, there's a lot of neuroplasticity, exercising your brain can make it work better. And then they took another group and they said, your intelligence is the result of your genetics and your evolutionary history, and it doesn't change very much. And they discovered that the first group of children, again, did better in school than the second group of children. So what you believed about how smart you were had as much to do with how smart you ended up being as how smart you actually were. All right. So again, beliefs add another element of complexity to the interaction between nature and nurture. And let me give you a last example. Those effects can be even more complicated. So far we've just been talking about effects that nurture or the environment have on a developing person. But one of the interesting things about development is that babies can actually have influences on adults, the adults around them, as well as adults having influences on babies. And in development, people talk about these as transactional effects. And a very good example of this is the case of different siblings growing up in the same family. That's actually a picture of my large, extremely large family of 6 children. I'm the one who's sitting there looking bossy sitting next to my father. When you actually look at siblings to a surprising degree, and everyone here who has a sibling will know this, you see really big differences in children who are growing up, after all, in very much the same kind of environment and in the same circumstances. And one idea about why that might happen is that parents, we know, and we'll talk about this later on, that babies can start out having relatively small differences in temperament. So some babies are easier, some babies are more difficult, some babies are more risk-taking, some babies are more nervous. And there are these kind of small differences to begin with in the way that individual babies work. But what's more interesting is that parents react differently to babies who have different temperaments. And not just parents, but all the other people around them. So if you have a risk-taking baby, then you might, depending on your temperament, either be more protective or less protective than if you have shy baby. If you have a baby, some babies, you put them in one of those swings that goes back and forth, and they think it's the most fantastic thing in the world, and they're totally happy. And other babies, you put them in one of those swings, and they scream, and they're totally miserable and unhappy. So what that means is that caregivers are going to change who they are, change the way that they interact, change the way that they behave, depending on these small temperament differences of the babies. So already, even things like whether a baby is born big and healthy and strong or whether a baby's born kind of weak and skinny makes a difference in how they're treated. And then those differences in the way that they're treated, in turn, change the way that those babies behave. So the babies are going to behave differently depending on how they're treated. So in my own example is my two oldest children are only about a year apart from one another. And the first one, Alexei, was from the time he was born big and strong and confident, and he'd grab onto a nipple and suck, and he was in charge of the universe. And the second baby was little and skinny and born a little bit early and basically spent his first 4 months snuggling up as close as he could possibly get to Mama, occasionally barely opening his eyes to look out at the world around him. And from a very early point, my attitude towards them, which they say has continued to this day, is, look, Alexei doesn't really need a lot of support and nurturance. He's fine. He'll get along just fine. And Nicholas, who at this point is actually an extremely successful hedge fund quant manager, as far as his mama is concerned, still requires much more careful nurturance and taking care of and worrying than Alexei does. And that turns out not just to be idiosyncratic. That's true about siblings in general. So if you want to know why you and your siblings end up being so different, part of it is small differences in the way your siblings work, but then the interactions that siblings have with parents, and also the interactions that siblings have with other siblings, end up making a big difference. So as we'll see later on, if you're a younger sibling, you're living in a very different environment and you're affecting your environment very differently than if you're an older sibling. So if you're a younger sibling, then you're calling out caregiving and bossiness on the part of your older sibling. And if you're an older sibling, then you're calling out neediness on the part of the younger sibling. So children are always, it isn't just that children are being shaped or affected by their environment, they're actually interacting with their environment. Is there a question?
Was the older one the one who boldly pressed the restart button from your computer?
No, that was actually the baby. That was actually the youngest one, who's not either of those, but the incredibly petted, spoiled, adorable baby, who's a whole other story. Okay, we do have 2 minutes left, so let's have a last explanation break before you go. So I want the other person, the person who didn't explain last time, to turn and explain why siblings are different to the other partner. So start at the second one.